It was around 4 o'clock in the morning when a man living in an apartment building near Ohio State University was suddenly awakened. At first, he wasn't sure what he was hearing, but then it happened again. Loud banging, the sound of something being knocked around in the apartment below him. And then something even more disturbing, the sound of a woman screaming from the apartment below. The screams were coming from the apartment where a 23-year-old woman named Stacey Colbert lived. The neighbor later reported hearing the disturbance for some time. At one point, he even put his ear to the floor to listen more closely to what was happening. But he didn't go check on Stacey right away. Hours passed. It wasn't until later that afternoon, around 2 p.m., that he finally went downstairs and knocked on her door. There was no answer. And by the time anyone realized what was truly going on, Stacey Colbert had vanished. Welcome back to Case Uncovered, where we uncover some of the most compelling and lesser-known true crime cases. I'm your host, Jen Rivera. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know that the cases we talk about here don't just disappear from my mind once the episode is finished. The truth is, all of these cases stay with me. But there are some cases that stick with me in a different way, especially the ones where I've had the opportunity to connect with the people who knew and loved the victim. When I speak with their friends, their families, the people who grew up with them, laughed with them, shared life with them, you start to learn about the person behind the case. You start to see who they really were. And in a way, it almost begins to feel like you know them too. So when those cases remain unsolved, when there's no resolution, no accountability, and no justice for the person whose life was taken, it's not just frustrating, it's infuriating. And sometimes the details of these cases leave you with the feeling that's really hard to shake, because the answers feel so close enough that it raises another question entirely. Why hasn't justice happened yet? And that's exactly why I created a new monthly series called Cases That Haunt Me. Once a month, I'll be revisiting cases that I've personally spent time investigating. Cases where I've connected with the people closest to the victim. And cases where the lack of answers still weighs heavily on everyone who loved them. Today's case is one of those stories. And that's the unsolved murder of Stacey Colbert. Stacey's case is one that has stayed with me for a long time. Not only because of the tragedy of what happened to her, but because when you really start looking closely at the details, something becomes painfully clear. The question of who may be responsible doesn't appear to be much of a mystery. So the real question becomes, why hasn't Stacey's case been solved? Why are we still talking about this today without answers, without justice, and without anyone being held accountable? Those are the questions that continue to haunt the people who loved Stacey. And they're the questions we're going to explore today. Now, if Stacey's name sounds familiar to some of you, that might be because I covered her case 2 years ago on the first season of my investigative podcast, The Unseen Truth. That season was designed to be short form and easily digestible for listeners. The entire season covering Stacey's case is about an hour in total, spread across 6 shorter episodes, and it includes interviews with Stacey's friends, family members, and the detective who continues to work her case today. So if you want to go deeper into Stacey's story after listening to today's episode, I highly encourage you to check that out. But today, we're going to walk through Stacey's story together. Because before Stacey became the subject of an unsolved murder investigation, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with her whole future ahead of her. And when her life was taken, she was only 23 years old. Before we go any further into the details of the case, it's important to take a moment and talk about who Stacey was. Because when a case becomes unsolved, the story often becomes focused entirely on the crime. But Stacey Colbert was so much more than the circumstances surrounding her death. In 1998, Stacey was 23 years old and living in Columbus, Ohio, just a few miles from the Ohio State University campus. The year before, she had graduated from Fisher College of Business at Ohio State with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, where she focused on marketing. She had big dreams of building a career in that field, and she was already well on her way. Stacey had recently started working as a marketing assistant at American Electric Power, one of the largest electric energy companies in the United States. For someone just starting out in their career, it was an exciting opportunity. She had her own apartment at the Governor's Square apartment complex, she was close to campus, and she was surrounded by the friends she had made during her time at Ohio State. Even better, her sister Danielle was nearby as well. The two had always been incredibly close growing up. Only about 2.5 years apart, they shared that kind of bond that many sisters have. The kind where you're not just family, but also friends. When Stacey eventually joined Danielle at Ohio State after first attending Lakeland Community College, the sisters created their own little tradition. They would meet up for coffee near campus and catch up on life. It was something simple, but it meant so much to both of them. Friends described Stacey as someone who was driven, social, and incredibly passionate about the things she cared about. She was the kind of person who gave 110% to everything she did, whether it was school, her career, or the friendships she built along the way. And by early 1998, it seemed like everything in Stacey's life was falling into place. She had a new job she was excited about, her own apartment, friends nearby, and a future that looked incredibly promising. The week of March 16, 1998 was a normal week according to Stacey's friends and family. There was nothing out of the ordinary that happened or any red flags. On the evening of Friday, March 20th, Stacey met up with friends and coworkers at a local spot in Columbus called Arlington Cafe. It was a familiar hangout for many people connected to Ohio State, and Stacey had spent time there before. Later that night, she returned home to her apartment. The next day, Saturday, March 21st, Stacey spent most of the day at home. She had originally planned to go out that evening, but according to reports, she wasn't feeling well and decided to stay in instead. At around 6 p.m., she ordered breadsticks from Papa John's. The delivery driver would later tell investigators that he had a very brief interaction with Stacey when he dropped off the order. It was the last time anyone is known to have seen her alive. After that moment, the timeline becomes quiet. Sometime during the early morning hours of Sunday, March 22nd, 1998, something violent unfolded inside Stacey's apartment. At around 4 a.m., a neighbor living in the apartment above Stacey woke up to the sound of loud banging. Then he heard something even more alarming: a woman screaming. The neighbor later told investigators that the sounds were coming from the apartment directly below his, Stacey's apartment. At one point, he put his ear to the floor to try to hear what was happening more clearly. But despite hearing what sounded like someone in distress, he didn't call the police. He didn't go downstairs to check on her either. Well, not right away at least. Instead, the morning passed. Hours went by. It wasn't until around 2 p.m. that afternoon that the neighbor finally went downstairs and knocked on Stacey's door. There was no answer, but sitting outside the apartment was Stacey's cat. For the people who knew Stacey, that detail alone was alarming. Stacey loved her cat and rarely let him outside, especially because the apartment complex sat near a busy road. Something clearly wasn't right. But it would take another day before Stacey's family realized something was terribly wrong. For nearly 2 days after the sounds were heard in Stacey's apartment, life around her continued as if nothing had happened. No one knew what had taken place inside that small apartment. Stacey didn't show up to work. She didn't return phone calls. And the people who loved her had no reason yet to believe something was terribly wrong. But eventually, the silence became impossible to ignore. The first real alarm came from Stacey's workplace. American Electric Power realized that Stacey had missed work, not just once, but multiple days. And that just wasn't like her. Stacey was dependable. She had only been in the role for a short time, And by all accounts, she took her job very seriously. When someone like that suddenly disappears from their responsibilities without warning, people notice, and they start asking questions. Around the same time, Stacey's sister Danielle had also been trying to reach her. At first, it didn't seem unusual that Stacey hadn't answered. But as the hours stretched into days, that feeling slowly began to change. Something didn't feel right. So Danielle decided to go check on her. She drove to Stacey's apartment at the Governor's Square complex in Columbus, not far from where Danielle was living. And when she arrived, it became immediately clear that something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Inside the apartment, many of Stacey's personal belongings were exactly where they should have been. Her purse was there, her wallet was there, her car keys were still inside the apartment, and outside in the parking lot, her car sat exactly where it had been left. If Stacey had gone somewhere willingly, she would have needed those things, but none of them had moved. As Danielle took in the scene, it became even more troubling. The front door had been slightly left open, and when police were called, investigators noticed a boot print on the inside of the door. In the kitchen area, it looked as though Stacey had been in the middle of an ordinary evening. On the counter sat the box of breadsticks she had ordered the night before, still partially eaten. Nearby was a gallon of milk, and the refrigerator door had been left open. But one detail stood out more than anything else. There was a strong smell of bleach throughout the apartment. After seeing the state of Stacey's apartment, Danielle called police. And once investigators began processing the scene, the picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. This didn't look like someone who had simply left home. Everything about the apartment suggested that something violent and unexpected had taken place there. And yet Stacey herself was nowhere to be found. Before we continue, I want to take a quick moment to talk about something that's very important to me, especially as we continue to talk about Stacey's case, and that's personal safety. As many of you know, I'm a sexual assault survivor, and because of that, I've always been intentional about making sure I have tools with me that help me feel prepared and protected when I'm out. One of the products I carry everywhere is the Safely Sidekick. I've been using Safely products since 2024, and it's something I truly don't leave home without. Whether I'm traveling, going to events, or just out running errands, it's always on my keychain. Safely creates personal safety tool devices that are designed to be easy to carry and quick to use if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need to protect yourself. Pepper spray is one of the simplest and most effective safety tools you can carry, and it's something I always recommend having with you. Safely is also a woman-owned and operated company, which is something I really appreciate and love highlighting. If you'd like to check out their products, visit livesafely.co and use code JEN for 10% off your order. Thank you, Safely, for sponsoring today's episode. Now, let's get back to the case. As investigators began examining the scene inside Stacey's apartment, several details immediately stood out. First, it appeared that Stacey had likely let her attacker inside willingly. There were no clear signs of forced entry, and considering the time of night this likely occurred, sometime during the early morning hours, it suggests Stacey may have known the person who came to her door. Another detail investigators noted was that while most of Stacey's belongings were still inside the apartment, two specific items were missing. The first was a gold necklace pendant with a pi symbol inside a diamond shape, a necklace Stacey wore as part of her sorority. The second item was an amethyst birthstone ring with a gold band that Stacey was known to wear regularly. Those two items were never recovered. Investigators also had to consider the timeline. Based on what the neighbor reported hearing, something happened inside Stacey's apartment at around 4 a.m. But the neighbor didn't go downstairs to check until 2 p.m. That's roughly a 10-hour window of time. 10 hours where whoever was responsible for what happened inside that apartment had plenty of time to leave, plenty of time to clean up, and plenty of time to make Stacey disappear. For detectives working the case, one possibility continued to emerge, and that was clearly that Stacey knew her attacker, someone who had access to her, someone she may have trusted enough to open the door for in the early morning hours. And as investigators began speaking with people in Stacey's life, certain names started to come up. One of those individuals was someone Stacey knew as an acquaintance. In Stacey's season 1 of The Unseen Truth, I referred to him as Bob. Now, Bob wasn't some random stranger. He was someone Stacey had spent time around before. Someone who had even helped her move into her apartment just months earlier. But when Stacey disappeared, something about Bob's reaction immediately raised questions. While friends, family members, and coworkers were actively searching for Stacey and trying to help investigators however they could, Bob reportedly didn't want anything to do with it. When Stacey's family tried reaching out to him, his response was clear. They were told to leave him alone. For many people, that reaction felt really strange. Because if someone you knew, someone you considered a friend, suddenly vanished under suspicious circumstances, most people would want to help. Most people would want to do anything they could to bring that person home. But Bob kept his distance and his silence. And while his alibi at the time appeared to check out, his behavior, on the other hand, was something investigators and those close to Stacey never forgot. For years after Stacey disappeared, her family, friends, and detectives were left with more questions than answers. Search efforts continued, tips were investigated, leads were followed. But Stacey remained missing. For Stacey's family, every day without answers was another day of uncertainty. They didn't know where she was. They didn't know what had happened inside that apartment. And they didn't know if they would ever get the chance to bring her home. Then, more than 6 years after Stacey vanished, there was finally a development in the case. On November 27, 2004, a man was walking through a wooded area along State Route 257 in Delaware County, Ohio. He had been searching for his dog. While walking through the wooded area, he came across something that immediately caught his attention: human remains. Authorities were called to the scene, and investigators began the process of determining who the remains belonged to. Eventually, those remains were identified as Stacey Colbert. For Stacey's family, the discovery brought a mix of emotions. After years of not knowing where Stacey was, they were finally able to bring her home and lay her to rest. But the answers they desperately wanted were still out of reach. Because due to the condition of Stacey's remains, the coroner was unable to determine an exact cause of death. Something that was also considered was whether Stacey's remains had been placed there at a later time. But detectives on the case believe Stacey had likely been in that location from the time of her disappearance until the day she was found. This meant that for more than 6 years, Stacey had been there, waiting to be discovered. And in the years after Stacey disappeared, while the person responsible remained free, the case slowly faded from public view, leaving her family to live with questions that seemed to have no answers. Now, long before Stacey's remains were found in 2004, the case had already entered the kind of silence that families of the missing know all too well. The searches slowed down, the calls came less often, public attention started to fade. The people left behind are forced to live in a kind of painful limbo, wondering if the case will ever move again. By August of 2001, it had been more than 3 years since Stacey disappeared from her apartment in Columbus. Publicly, there was very little movement, and for the people who loved her, that kind of silence was its own kind of heartbreak. When a case goes quiet for that long, people start looking anywhere they can for answers. That included information that came in from individuals claiming to have psychic abilities. Now, whether someone believes in psychics or not, I think it's important to acknowledge why families sometimes turn to those kinds of leads. When you love someone and you have no idea where they are, when years go by and there's still no arrest, no trial, no justice, and sometimes no body to bring home, you start hoping that maybe, somehow, one detail from somewhere will be the thing that finally breaks the case open. In Stacey's case, detectives were not using psychics as part of the official investigation. But there were anonymous psychic-style tips and recounts that circulated over the years, including one in 2001 and another in 2004. And what made them stand out was how specific some of the descriptions were. Some of those statements pointed to the possibility that Stacey's remains were in a remote outdoor area. And after Stacey was finally found near State Route 257 in Delaware County, those details became even more unsettling in hindsight. Now, to be very clear, psychic tips are not evidence. They are not admissible in court, and they do not replace real investigative work. But they do become part of the larger story, especially in this case, because they reflect the desperation people felt to find Stacey, and because some of those descriptions were disturbing enough that they stayed with people. There were even people outside the official investigation who wondered whether the person submitting one of those anonymous tips might have known more than they should have known. That, of course, is speculation, and speculation is not proof. But what it does show is just how deeply people felt that the answer in Stacey's case was always sitting just beneath the surface, that the truth was so close, that someone knew, that someone still knows. And even after Stacey was finally found, that feeling didn't go away, because finding Stacey mattered deeply, but it didn't solve the case. It didn't answer exactly what happened inside her apartment, and it did not put the person responsible behind bars. Today, Stacey Colbert's case is still officially considered an unsolved homicide. As of March 11th, 2026, it has been 28 years since Stacey disappeared, and more than 21 years since her remains were found in November 2004. That is nearly 3 decades without the kind of justice Stacey and her family deserve. Nearly 3 decades without answers. Nearly 3 decades without accountability. And that is exactly why this case continues to haunt me. Because when you spend time looking at the facts of this case, when you speak with the people who loved Stacey, and when you really sit with the timeline of what happened, it becomes difficult to ignore what many people connected to this case have believed for a very long time. That Stacey likely knew the person responsible, and that belief makes this case even more frustrating. Because if Stacey knew the person who hurt her, then it's very possible that someone else knows something too. Someone may remember a conversation, a strange reaction, or a story that never quite made sense. A detail that didn't seem important at the time but feels very different looking back now. That's often how cases like this are solved. Not just through forensic evidence, but through someone deciding that it's finally time to speak up. I also had the opportunity to briefly speak with the detective currently assigned to Stacey's case when I was producing the series about her story. And while there are details investigators obviously cannot share publicly, one thing was clear. This case has not been forgotten. Investigators are still working on it, and advances in DNA technology continue to give people hope that one day the evidence will finally point directly to the person responsible. One of the ways Stacey's story continues to stay alive today is through a page called Finishing Stacey's Fight. The page is run by Stacey's friends and family, the people who knew and loved her, and who have never stopped fighting for answers. They continue to share updates about the case and encourage people to keep Stacey's story visible, because sometimes all it takes is the right person seeing a post, remembering something, or finally deciding to come forward. Stacey's story is not over, and the people who loved her are determined to keep fighting until the person responsible is finally held accountable. Cases like Stacey's remind us why stories like this matter, because behind every case file, every police report, every headline, is a real person whose life mattered. Stacey was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. She was someone who had an entire future ahead of her. And while her life was taken far too soon, the people who loved her continue to make sure that her voice is never silenced. Stories like Stacey's deserve to be told, and they deserve to be remembered. And as a listener, one of the most powerful things you can do is share this episode. The more people who hear Stacey's story, the greater the chance that someone out there may remember something or come forward with information. If you have any information about the murder of Stacey Colbert, please contact the Delaware County, Ohio Detective Bureau at 740-833-2830. I'll make sure to add the information in the show notes below. And if you'd like to continue following updates in Stacey's case, make sure to follow Finishing Stacey's Fight on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Before we close today's episode, I want to take a moment to share something really important that we're working on through the Reignited Project. If you're new here, the Reignited Project is a 501c3 nonprofit that I founded dedicated to advocacy, awareness, and support for families impacted by violent crime and missing persons cases. Right now, our team is preparing for our next community donation drive, where we'll be collecting non-perishable food items for the Lockport Fish Pantry and local micro pantries here in the Chicagoland area. These pantries help provide meals and everyday essentials for families in our community who may be going through a difficult time, and we're really honored to be able to contribute to that effort. If you're local to the Chicagoland area and would like to donate items or help support this drive, you can reach out directly to Rose, our Director of Community Advocacy and Outreach. You can contact her via email at rose@thereignitedproject.com. I'll make sure I leave her contact information in the show notes below. And if you'd like to stay connected with the work we're doing through the Reignited Project and become a part of our community, what we call the Hive, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter. That's where we share updates on our advocacy work, upcoming initiatives, and ways you can get involved. You can sign up by visiting thereignitedproject.com. As always, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Case Uncovered for our monthly series, Cases That Haunt Me. Whether you're a longtime listener or you're new to the show, leaving a 5-star rating and review is one of the easiest ways you can support the podcast. It's completely free, it only takes a few seconds, and it helps more people discover these stories. More listeners means more awareness for the cases and the families we talk about here. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe out there. Fire Eyes Media.